There are farmers who clear land with chemicals and equipment, and then there are farmers who use 30 hogs. Nobody wanted to buy. Walt Haney was the second type. He had 80 acres of Ozark hill ground that invasive brush had swallowed for 30 years, a well that was going dry, and no money for the machinery or the spray that would have fixed either problem. When a man named Ray Tatum called him with 30 heritage hogs he couldn't sell, Walt took them, put them on the worst ground he had, and let them do what they were bred to do. What they found under the brush changed the farm in a way that no machine could have. Walt Haney was 58 years old, and he farmed 120 acres in Newton County, Arkansas, in the Boston Mountains of the Ozark Range. The ground was typical of the Ozarks: thin soil over limestone, steep hollows, creek bottoms that flooded in spring and went dry by August. His father, Earl Haney, bought the place in 1962 with a GI loan and cleared 40 acres for pasture by hand, pulling stumps with a cable and a farm all age. The other 80 acres was always wooded, open oak and hickory forest with native grass underneath, the kind of ground a man could walk through and see where he was going. Earl ran 30 head of Hereford cattle on the 40 acres and let the 80 grow timber. He kept a few hogs in the 1,972nd, Tamworths, and a couple of spot-faced crosses, turning them out in the woods to forage for acorns and roots. Pigs on a farm weren't an operation then, they were a tool. Earl sold the hogs when the local butcher shop in Jasper closed in 1981, and there was nowhere left to take them. Earl died in 2015 at 81. Walt had been farming the place with him since he got back from a manufacturing plant in Springfield in 1992, and he took over alone. He kept the 40 acres in hay and cattle, 20 head on a good year, 15 on a bad one. The 80 acres he let go, because he didn't have the time, the equipment, or the money to manage it, and the woods didn't look like a problem. They looked like woods. Within 5 years they weren't woods anymore. Multiflora rose moved in first, then autumn olive and bush honeysuckle, the invasive species that had been choking Ozark hill ground for decades. They grew thick and fast, crowding out the native grass and the oak seedlings, forming walls of brush so dense a man couldn't see 10 feet into them. By 2020, nobody could walk through the 80 acres. Nobody could ride a horse through it. Nobody could get a tractor in. Walt's well was the other problem. He drilled it in 1998, 180 feet deep through the limestone, and it had always been enough for the house and the cattle. The last 2 summers, the flow had dropped. By August of 2020, the pump was sucking air and the pressure tank was cycling every 20 minutes. Walt hauled water in a 500-gallon tank, bolted to the bed of his 1996 Ford F-350, 3 trips a week to the county water fill station in Jasper, 12 miles round trip. The fill station charged $2 per 1,000 gallons, so the water was cheap. The diesel wasn't. At $3.8 a gallon and 8 miles to the gallon hauling a full load, each trip cost $5.7 in fuel. 3 trips a week came to $68 a month, just in diesel, on top of the 3 hours it took out of his day. He'd looked into fixing both problems the conventional way. A forestry mulching service out of Harrison had quoted him $100 per hour, with an estimate of 80 to 120 hours for the 80 acres, which put the job at $8,000 to $12,000. The ground was too steep and rocky in the hollows for the mulcher to reach every section. Chemical spraying would run $40 to $60 per acre, and he'd need a skid steer with a boom sprayer to get through the brush, which he didn't own. Deepening the well was another $6,000 to $8,000, and the driller told him the water table was dropping across the county, so going deeper might not even help. Walt didn't have $8,000, and he didn't have $4,800. He had a cattle operation that grossed about $22,000 a year and netted less than half of that, a truck with 230,000 miles on it, and a 1974 Ford 4000 tractor that he'd kept running with parts he pulled off 2 dead tractors at the salvage yard in Green Forest. He wasn't poor in the way that some people are poor, with debt piling up and creditors calling. He was poor in the way that a lot of Ozark farmers are poor, which is to say he had land and no money, and the land was losing value every year. The brush grew thicker, and the well ran thinner. Walt wasn't the kind of man who complained about it. He fixed the tractor when it broke, and hauled the water when the well dropped, checked the fence lines, and put up hay and did the work that needed doing. But by the spring of 2021, he was running out of ways to solve problems with what he had. The 11th of March, 2021. Ray Tatum called Walt on a Tuesday afternoon. Ray was 72 and had been raising heritage hogs for 30 years on a small farm outside Green Forest, about 90 miles north of Walt's place. Ray's health had been going downhill for 2 years. His hips were bad, his knees were worse, and his doctor had told him in January that he needed both hips replaced and couldn't keep hauling 50-pound sacks of feed or walking fence lines in the mud. Ray's kids lived in Tulsa and Little Rock, and neither of them wanted the farm. Ray had 30 hogs, 12 Tamworths, 10 Gloucestershire Old Spots, and 8 large blacks. He'd built that herd over 25 years, buying breeding stock from 3 conservation breeders, keeping records on every litter, culling carefully, and maintaining the genetic lines the way the Livestock Conservancy recommended. These weren't commodity hogs. They were old line breeds, the kind that farmers had raised for centuries before the pork industry changed. The Tamworths were the oldest of the 3. Long-bodied, ginger-colored, with narrow backs and long snouts built for rooting. One quote. The breed had been in the United States since the 1882nd brought over from England, and it had been selected for one thing above all others: the ability to live outside and feed itself. Tamworths were foragers. They'd eat roots, grubs, acorns, tubers, and anything else they could dig out of the ground. Their snouts were longer than any commercial breed, and they used them like plows. The Livestock Conservancy listed Tamworths as threatened, with annual registrations, low enough that the breed's long-term survival depended on people like Ray keeping them going. The Gloucestershire Old Spots were the rarest. White coats with black spots, heavy-bodied, calm-tempered, known in England as the orchard pig because farmers used them to clean up windfall apples and glean the residue from cider presses. They were excellent grazers, listed as critical. With fewer than 200 annual registrations in the United States and a global population under 2,000. Ray had 10 of them, including a boar and 4 sows, and he'd been offered $500 apiece for breeding stock 2 years ago from a farm in Virginia. Now nobody was offering anything. The large blacks were the biggest. Solid black, massive framed, with lop ears that hung forward over their faces like blinders. Those ears weren't decorative. When a large black rooted through brush and thorns, the ears protected its eyes from getting scratched. The breed had been the most numerous pig in England in 1900, valued for producing pork and bacon on nothing but pasture and forage. By the 1962, the industrial shift to confinement operations had pushed them to the edge. The Livestock Conservancy listed them as critical. Ray's problem was that the market for heritage hogs had collapsed in his area. 2 small processors who'd butchered pigs for individual farmers had shut down in the last 3 years, one in Eureka Springs and one in Berryville. The restaurant in Fayetteville that had been buying Ray's pork for $4 a pound had changed chefs and switched to a supplier in Missouri. The customers who'd bought whole and half hogs directly from Ray had stopped calling. He was left with 30 animals he couldn't sell to anyone who valued what they were. The livestock auction in Fayetteville would take them, but at slaughter prices. A Tamworth, or a large black at the auction, would bring maybe $30 to $40 a head, priced by the pound at around $0.3, the same rate as any commercial cross. Ray would get a check for about $1,200, and the hogs would go to a processing plant that didn't care what breed they were. 30 years of breeding work would end up as commodity pork. Ray called Walt because he remembered Earl Haney. Ray and Earl had traded breeding stock in the 1972, back when keeping a few hogs on the farm was just what farmers did. Ray had been at Earl's funeral in 2015, and he talked to Walt that day, briefly, about the hogs Earl used to run. Walt had said his father always talked about those Tamworths. Ray remembered that conversation. "I've got 30 hogs I can't sell," Ray said on the phone. "I can't take care of them anymore. The auction will give me 30 cents a pound, and that's the end of it. I'd rather they went to somebody who'd keep them." Walt was quiet for a minute. He hadn't had hogs in 30 years. He didn't have a hog pen, a hog feeder, or a hog fence. What he had was 80 acres of brush that nothing could get through, a borrowed stock trailer, and the memory of his father saying that a Tamworth could root through a concrete driveway if a man let it. "I'll come get them Saturday," Walt said. Walt drove to Ray's place on Saturday, the 15th of March, with a borrowed stock trailer behind the F-350. Ray's farm was 90 miles north, 2 hours on the winding highways through the Ozark Hill country. Walt pulled in at 10 in the morning and found Ray sitting on the porch of a farmhouse that needed paint and a roof that needed shingles. The hog paddocks were behind the house, 5 acres of rotated grazing divided by electric fence. Ray walked Walt through them slowly, his hips visibly bothering him on the uneven ground. The Tamworths were in the first paddock, 12 of them, ginger-colored and long-snouted, already rooting along the fence line when Walt walked up. The boar was the biggest, maybe 550 pounds, with a snout that looked like it had been designed for one purpose. He was turning over the soil in a steady line, 6 inches deep, methodical, like a man plowing a field. The Gloucestershire Old Spots were in the second paddock, white with black spots, calmer than the Tamworths, grazing along the grass and browsing the low branches of an oak at the fence line. 2 sows were lying in a wallow they'd dug near the water trough, their piglets nursing. In the back paddock were the large blacks, 8 of them, black as tar with ears that hung down over their faces. So far they had to tilt their heads to see Walt coming. Ray talked about each breed the way a man talks about his children. The Tamworths were the workers, the rooters, the ones that would tear up ground the fastest. The Old Spots were the grazers, the ones that would eat grass and clean up after the Tamworths turned the soil. The large blacks were the steady ones, big and calm, content to root and graze and lie in the shade, and their ears kept the thorns out of their eyes when the brush got thick. Walt loaded all 30 hogs onto the trailer. Ray didn't charge him. He signed over the registration papers for the breeding stock and shook Walt's hand at the gate. "They're good animals," Ray said. "They just need somebody who'll let them work." Walt got home at 4 in the afternoon and backed the trailer up to a 1/4-acre pen he'd built the week before from cattle panels and T-posts, with a single strand of hot wire on the inside to train the hogs to respect electric fence. He'd read about rotational grazing with pigs, and he knew the first rule: don't turn them out until they'd learned the fence. A hog that doesn't respect electric will go through it like it isn't there, and once they're out in 80 acres of brush, they'll never be caught. He kept them in the training pen for 2 weeks, feeding them once a day, letting them test the hot wire and learn the shock. By the end of the second week, none of them went near the wire because they'd figured it out, the 29th of March. Walt set up the first paddock. He ran 3 strands of electric fence around a 1-acre section of the worst brush on the 80. The stuff that was so thick, he'd had to cut a path through it with a machete just to set the posts. The fence went up at 4, 8, and 12 inches off the ground, low enough to stop a piglet from crawling under, and high enough to catch a 300-pound Tamworth on the snout. He hooked the fence to a solar-powered charger rated for 20 acres and turned the hogs in. They went to work within an hour. The Tamworths hit the brush first, pushing through the multiflora rows with their shoulders and rooting under the root mats with their snouts. The sound was something Walt hadn't heard before, a rhythmic grunting and tearing, the snap of roots being pulled out of clay, the crash of cane thickets falling as the hogs bulldozed through them. The large blacks followed, using their weight to flatten the brush the Tamworths had loosened, their lop ears folding forward over their eyes as they pushed into the thorns. The Gloucestershire Old Spots came in behind, grazing the young growth and the forbs that the others had exposed, eating the weeds and the saplings down to the ground. In 2 weeks, the 1-acre section went from impenetrable thicket to worked ground. The soil was turned, the root mats were torn up, the brush was flattened and eaten. Where 6-foot multiflora rows had been, there was bare, dark earth, fertilized with hog manure and waiting for seed. Walt moved the fence and put them on the next acre. The pattern settled into a rhythm, all. 2 weeks per paddock, then moved the fence. Walt built the paddocks as 1-acre sections, running the polywire and fiberglass posts on Sunday morning before church, moving the hogs Sunday afternoon. He seeded each cleared paddock behind them with red clover and buckwheat, broadcasting the seed by hand from a shoulder cradle, then dragging a section of chain-link fence behind the Ford 4000 to press the seed into the worked soil. The clover germinated in 7 days. The buckwheat came up in 5. The soil changed faster than Walt expected. What had been packed leaf litter and root-bound clay was becoming loose, dark, loamy earth. The hog's manure added nitrogen and organic matter. The rooting aerated the soil and broke up the compaction that years of brush cover had caused. The cover crops held the soil in place, prevented erosion on the slopes, and added biomass as they grew and decomposed. By the middle of May, the first 3 paddocks had knee-high clover growing where multiflora rows had been 6 feet thick 3 months earlier. Walt's feed costs dropped as the hogs learned to feed themselves off the land. In the training pen, he'd been feeding them $180 a week in a 16% protein pellet from the co-op in Jasper. Once they were on the brush, the Tamworths barely touched the feed trough. They'd spend all day rooting, pulling grubs and roots and tubers out of the ground, and come to the trough at dusk for a token amount. The old spots grazed the clover and the young grass that came up behind the rooting. The large blacks were the heaviest feeders, but even they cut their intake by half on good forage. Walt's weekly feed bill went from $180 to about $80 by the end of May, and it kept dropping as more paddocks came online. The feed savings mattered. Walt was running the hog operation on money he didn't really have. He'd spent $400 on electric fencing supplies, $180 on the solar charger, $120 on cover crop seed, and $80 a week on feed. The total outlay was under $1,500, less than a single month's payment on a forestry mulching contract. But it was still $1,500 he didn't have, pulled from the cattle operation's operating cash and replaced by nothing. The hogs were costing him money. They wouldn't make money until he could sell them, and he didn't know when or how he'd do that. Dale Minton, Walt's neighbor to the east, drove by on his 4-wheeler one Saturday in early June and stopped where the fence crossed the county road. Dale ran 200 head of commercial Angus cattle on 320 acres and sprayed his pastures with herbicide every spring, paying a custom applicator $18 an acre to keep the brush back. He watched the hogs rooting in the 4th paddock and shook his head. "You're going to ruin that ground, Walt," Dale said. "Pigs will tear it up. You'll have nothing but mud and weeds when they're done." Walt didn't argue. He nodded and kept walking the fence line, checking the charge on the tester, looking for shorts where branches had fallen on the wire. Dale watched him for a minute, then drove off. July came and Walt worked the hogs through the 8th paddock. 60 of the 80 acres were cleared or in progress. The first 6 paddocks were growing clover and fescue and native bluestem, the grass coming back on its own once the brush was gone and the sunlight hit the ground. Walt put 5 cattle on the first 3 paddocks to graze the new growth, and they gained weight on clover that had been planted by a hog and grown in soil that a hog had turned. One Saturday evening in late July, Walt sat on the tailgate of his truck and watched the hogs in paddock 6. The large black sows were lying in a wallow they dug near a white oak, their piglets nursing in the shade. 2 old spot gilts were grazing the clover in the cleared section, white coats bright against the green. A Tamworth boar was rooting along the fence line, turning over soil that hadn't seen sunlight in 30 years. The air smelled like turned earth and clover and hog manure, which was not a smell that bothered a man who'd grown up around livestock. Walt drank his coffee and watched them work. The 3rd of August. One of the large black sows farrowed in the corner of paddock 7. She'd built a nest from clover and oak leaves, piling them into a mound about 3 feet across, and she'd farrowed 11 piglets in it overnight. Walt counted them the next morning. The sow was calm, letting him get close enough to check the piglets without getting up. The herd was now 41. August 2021. The rain stopped. Newton County went 42 days without measurable precipitation. The grass in the 40-acre pasture turned brown by the 2nd week. Walt's pond, a half-acre spring-fed pond, his father had dug in 1978, dropped 6 inches in a week and kept dropping. The creek that ran through the bottom of the property went dry for the first time in Walt's memory, the 19th of August. Walt turned on the well pump and got a trickle. He checked the pressure switch, the lines, the casing. Everything was functional. The aquifer was dropping. He called Dan Pruitt, the well driller out of Harrison, who told him the water table across the county was low this year and that he might need to go deeper, maybe another 40 feet. Pruitt quoted him $150 a foot for drilling, which put the job at $6,000, plus a new pump and casing, bringing the total to $8,000. Walt thanked him and hung up. He went back to hauling water. But now he was hauling for the house, the cattle, and 41 hogs. The 500-gallon tank on the F-350 meant 4 trips a day to the fill station in Jasper, 48 miles of driving, every day. The old Ford burned a gallon every 8 miles loaded, and at $4.1 a gallon for diesel, each trip cost $6.15 in fuel. 4 trips was $24.6 a day. Over a week, that was $172. Over a month, $738. Walt's cattle operation netted about $10,000 a year after expenses. He was burning through a month's income every month just hauling water. The hogs needed water most. In 95-degree heat, 41 hogs would drain a 100-gallon stock tank in 4 hours. Walt filled the tank in each paddock twice a day, morning and evening, which meant 2 extra trips to the fill station on top of the cattle and the house. He was leaving the house at 5 in the morning and getting back after dark, spending his entire day hauling water and checking on animals and fixing the things that broke when a man was running a farm on no sleep and no money. He thought about selling the hogs. He could load them up and take them to the auction in Fayetteville and get $30 to $40 a head, the same fate Ray had been trying to avoid. 41 hogs at $35 a head would bring about $1,435. It would cover his diesel costs for 2 months and eliminate the water demand from the hogs. It would also end the experiment, clear out the brush clearing operation, and send Ray Tatum's breeding work to the kill floor. Walt stood in paddock 8 one evening watching the hogs crowd around the stock tank and thought about it. The Tamworths came to the tank first, drinking deep, their long snouts submerged to the eyes. The large blacks waited their turn, patient, ears hanging over their faces. The old spots lay in the mud near the tank too hot to move, letting the water seep into the soil around them and cool the ground. The piglets from the August litter were running between their mother's legs, too young to understand what a drought was. Walt didn't sell them, not because he had a plan, because he told Ray he'd keep them, and that meant something. The diesel costs kept mounting, the well kept dropping. The weather forecast on the radio said another 10 days without rain. Walt hauled water and waited for something to change, the 25th of August. Walt moved the hogs to paddock 9, the lowest section of the 80 acres down in a hollow at the bottom of the slope, where the ground flattened out before the creek. This was the thickest brush on the property. The soil here stayed damp longer than anywhere else, and the multiflora rose had grown head-high in the wet ground, woven together with honeysuckle vines and autumn olive, so dense that Walt had spent 2 hours cutting a path for the fence with a machete and a brush axe. He set the paddock at 1.5 acres instead of the usual one, because the brush was so thick the hogs would need more room to work. He ran the 3-strand fence, checked the charge, and turned them in. The hogs went to work harder than Walt had seen them work anywhere else. The ground was softer here, the soil deeper, and the Tamworths dug deeper than they had on any previous paddock. A foot, maybe more. They tore through the root mats with a ferocity Walt hadn't seen since the first paddock, pulling out roots as thick as his wrist, turning the soil in great clods that rolled down the slope. The large blacks followed, their weight pushing through the thickest brush, flattening the honeysuckle and the autumn olive. The old spots grazed behind them, eating the young growth and the tender shoots that came up when the canopy was stripped away. The 29th of August. Walt walked the paddock to check the fence and noticed water pooling in a depression the hogs had rooted out near the bottom of the hollow. It wasn't rainwater. There hadn't been rain in 5 weeks. It was seeping up from below, a small steady trickle running across the exposed soil and collecting in the low spot the hogs had dug. The water was clear and cool, and it was coming up through a crack in the limestone that the hogs had exposed by stripping away 3 decades of leaf litter, root mats, and brush that had sealed it over. Walt knelt down and put his hand in it. The water was cold, maybe 55 degrees, the temperature of groundwater coming up from deep in the limestone. He followed the seep uphill and found the source, a fracture in the rock about 8 inches wide, partially filled with clay and organic matter that the hogs had rooted out. The water was pushing through the fracture at a steady rate, not a gush but a constant flow that was already filling the depression faster than it could drain away. The Ozarks run on limestone. The whole Boston mountain range is karst terrain, cracked and dissolved by water over millions of years, creating caves and springs and underground channels that carry water from the ridges down to the valleys. Springs in the Ozarks aren't rare, but they're easy to lose. A spring that seeps a gallon a minute through a crack in the limestone will get buried under leaf litter and brush in a few years if nobody keeps it open, and once it's buried, nobody would ever know it was there unless somebody dug for it. Walt dug the seep out by hand. He took a shovel and a mattock and spent the rest of the day widening the opening, clearing the clay and the organic matter out of the fracture, lining the collection basin with flat stones he pulled from the creek bed. By evening, the flow was steady, and the basin was filling. He filled a 5-gallon bucket in 4 minutes. He did the math in his head. At that rate, the spring was producing 75 gallons an hour, which was 1800 gallons a day. His well, on its best day, produced 600 gallons. He ran a 1/2-inch poly pipe from the spring box down to a 300-gallon stock tank. He sat at the edge of the paddock. The tank filled overnight. The hogs drank from it the next morning, the water cold and clean and free. Walt didn't haul water that day, and he didn't haul it the next day either. The spring kept flowing through the drought. It didn't slow. The limestone aquifer that fed it was deeper and more reliable than the shallow well that had been dropping all summer. While every other water source on the property was failing or dry, the spring in the bottom of the hollow kept pushing out 75 gallons an hour, steady and cold and indifferent to the weather. The drought broke on the 28th of September. 3 inches of rain in 2 days, the first measurable precipitation in 7 weeks. The grass in the 40-acre pasture greened up within a week. Walt's pond refilled. The well recovered, though Walt knew it would drop again next summer, the same way it had dropped the summer before, and the summer before that. The spring kept flowing, and never stopped. Walt developed the spring properly in October. He built a concrete spring box over the collection basin, 4 feet square and 3 feet deep, with a screened intake and a clean-out pipe. He buried 300 feet of 1/2-inch poly pipe from the spring box to a 500-gallon storage tank he set on a concrete pad on the hill above the house. Gravity-fed water from the tank to the paddocks, the cattle troughs, and the house. Through 3/4-inch lines he trenched with the Ford 4000 and a middle buster. The total cost was $640 in materials from the hardware store in Jasper. He did the work himself in 4 days. The well became a backup. The spring became the primary water source. By November, The Hogs had worked through 12 paddocks, clearing 60 of the 80 acres. The cleared ground was growing clover, fescue, and native bluestem. Walt put 10 cattle on the new pasture for the first time, grazing ground that hadn't seen a cow in 30 years. The cattle gained on the clover, which was higher in protein than the fescue in the old pasture, and Walt didn't have to haul water because the spring fed every trough through the gravity system. The herd was 52 hogs by November, the original 30, plus piglets, from 3 litters. Walt sold 2 barrows to a restaurant in Fayetteville that was looking for heritage pork, a place that had opened 6 months earlier and was buying from small farms. They paid $3.5 per pound, hanging weight, which came to about $420 per hour. Og. That was more than 10 times what the auction in Fayetteville would have paid Ray Tatum. Dale Minton stopped by in late November. He didn't say much. He walked the cleared paddocks, looked at the spring box, watched the hogs rooting in the last section of brush. He asked Walt what kind of fence he was using. Walt told him. Dale nodded and drove away. Walt didn't expand. He kept the herd at what the land could support and rotated them through the paddocks on the same 2-week cycle. The spring flowed, the pasture grew. The hogs did what they were bred to do, on ground that everybody else had given up on. How? On a November morning, Walt stood at the spring box watching the water run from the limestone. The hogs rooted above. He'd saved them from the kill floor, and they'd found the water that saved the farm. The things the world throws away sometimes hold what a man needs most, but he only finds that out if he takes them in. Subscribe to Rust and roots for more stories from the Heartland.